What's up everyone? I wanted to make this video and these subsequent videos talking about offensive line depth in your stance. So all we're going to talk about is what it looks like to get into your stance, how far off the ball you're allowed to be, how offensive linemen have been lining up for a while, why this is now an issue. So first off, I do want to kind of explain why offensive linemen like to have space. So the center, obviously, he's in a stance with the ball. He only has so much space. But the guards align off of him, the tackles align off of him, and for the most part, you want to gain space so that you have room to work and to operate. Now, it's kind of a core tenet in offensive line play that on a run play, you want to make your contact on the second step. And so, I'm going to turn this way. You know, if I have a guy who's lined up here, and I start moving and he moves towards me, you know, I can't get that second step in the ground, right? But if he's here, and I can go 1, 2, and by the time I make contact, I got that second step in the ground. So getting that space is really important in the run game, and obviously in the pass game, it's even more important. And so in the pass game, you're looking to get on the intersection point of basically where the guy you're blocking is trying to get to towards the quarterback. So for guards, again, more on the inside, they're not gonna have to be, quote unquote, have to be aligned as deep as offensive tackles. Some guys prefer it, some guys don't. Depends on if you're a guard who likes to get on guys and get your hands on them. Typically, you're a little closer to the line. If you're a guy that likes to set a little more like a tackle, maybe you're a former tackle in college, you're kind of used to that space. Typically, then you'll like to be a little deeper and like to play with a little bit more space. But even then, you see Aaron Donald, wide 3, obviously retired now. Chris Jones, you see these defensive tackles who are really quick, really fast. They're starting to align wider and wider on guards. And so now guards are starting to feel like, well, I have to align a little deeper because now my spot is a little bit further. And so it's all about getting to your ankle. Now for offensive tackles, obviously we're lined up the furthest. Our guy is also very far away from us at times. We have to defend for upwards of 10 yards deep in the pocket. And so when you're in your stance, when you're taking that pass set, the guy that you're blocking, your contact point is probably gonna be maybe 5 yards deep, 4 yards deep, 6 yards deep, whatever it is. And he's faster than we are. And we're going backwards. Now we do know the snap count, but he's going forwards and he runs a 4.4 to 4.6. We're going backwards, having ran, for me, a 5.4. Some guys run 4.8s, but typically, you know, 5.0 to 5.2 these days. And so all you're trying to do is gain some extra distance to get to your spot before that guy gets there. And you want to get there in a good position. You don't want to feel, oh man, he's already got the corner on me. That leads to bad pass sets, that leads to bad outcomes. And so gaining depth off the line, just in your stance, can buy you, 1, 2, if you're doing it kind of a tricky way, 2.5 yards of extra space to get out of your stance, get to your spot, and beat that guy who's coming for the quarterback. So there's a lot of other things. I'm gonna break this up so it's not too much information in one video, but let's follow along and I hope to bring some good information to you all. Okay, let's talk about the actual rule and where offensive linemen are allowed to align. So the rule says that your helmet has to be breaking the waistline or the belt line of the center, which isn't the most specific. Theoretically, the waist or the belt, you could argue when he's in a stance, is that here, is it here? I feel like in the last couple of years, they've kind of defined it to be like basically where that hip bone is, or maybe not hip bone, but like kind of where that hip is. So when the center's in a stance, it's kind of in this area. Now, when I got in the league, 2012, it did seem like basically you just had to be, from the official's view, breaking the plane of the center. And so it seems that it migrated that forward a little bit. Now, I don't know what the actual rule is then. I don't know if it's always been the same. It's just a different point of emphasis. But I feel like for the most part, as long as you were not totally behind the back point of the center, you were okay. And I played in Cleveland. We watched a lot of Baltimore film, and Marshall Yalma in particular, right guard, fantastic player. He aligned very deep, like super deep, former, I think, tackle in college, and also just took tackle pass sets. It was awesome to watch, and then him just destroy guys. But he basically was lined up, so like center's butt, and like the tip of his helmet was here. And so Michael Orr, right tackle, or Ricky Wagner, right tackle, they would have to align perfectly level with him. They couldn't be any deeper than Marshall because Marshall was setting the full depth of where you're allowed to align. And so you look at Kansas City, typically the guards have aligned, say this is Creed or the center. Kansas City's guards typically align more, here on the quote unquote legal allowance of where you're supposed to be. So a guy like Jawan, a guy like myself, we would have to align a little bit deeper than where the guard is to actually get on that line of where we're supposed to be legal. And so that gets into a whole different thing that we're going to talk about down the road. But just in terms of where the tackle and where the offensive linemen are allowed to line up, we wanted to talk about that. We wanted to kind of set the parameters. So the center's in a stance. It's pretty much, kind of here on the center. And so from the tackle's perspective, you're not necessarily like lining up and looking at it and making sure. But I'm going to get into that in the next video, kind of the process of getting the play in the huddle, going to the line of scrimmage, how you're aligning. But I did want to define where you are supposed to line up. All right, so we're going to talk about linemen getting to the line of scrimmage, kind of what it looks like, what the feels are. So obviously, get play call, break the huddle, go to the line. Every line coach likes to preach running to the line of scrimmage, kind of putting pressure on the defense, making it feel like you're there, the emphasis. We see plenty of teams, especially late in games, when you're tired, break the huddle and walk up to the line. But center gets the ball first, he gets aligned. And the guard is going to get aligned off of the center. And now typically you would hear maybe 1.5 feet in terms of the guard's alignment off the center width-wise. We're not talking about depth right now. Realistically, probably closer to 2 feet if you were to actually get down there and measure. I think 1.5 feet, maybe from yesteryear where everyone was in I formation and fullbacks and running the ball a lot. And then tackles are told 1.5, 2 feet, which again is probably 2.5 feet when you're actually getting down there. So as the offensive tackle, I can't get set until the guard gets set. So me and the guard get up to the line at about the same time. We're kind of looking inward. I'm looking at the guard. He's kind of getting his thing figured out. I'm looking at that right foot. And so now I can see where his foot is. I can get my proper width. I can get in my stance. In terms of the depth off the ball, that's something that, again, you're not like looking at the center to like see where his butt is and like line it up. I think you just have an intrinsic feel for it. When, again, we're talking about NFL players. So at this point, you're at the highest level. You've shown that you know how to line up and how to play football. And so as that tackle, you're getting lined width-wise off the guard, and depth-wise, you kind of understand where the center is. And you've gone into enough stances, you've played enough football, you kind of understand, all right, this is like the depth off the ball relative to where the center's ball is. Because again, once you're in your stance, you can't see the center's butt anyway, unless you're like in a 2-point stance looking over the top of your guard. Your guard's in the way. So there is an element of like just knowing where you are relative to the guard, relative to the spacing on the football field. And so that's kind of the process. Hear the play call, go up to the line as the tackle, wait for the guard to get set, and then you get set. And so on third downs per se, like you talk about stances and tipping, and you like to say get in the same stance with the same depth every single time. That's not reality. That's not how it works. We've seen plenty of guards who are pulling, have a really deep stance, and they give it away. Tackles, the deeper you are, more likely it is a pass play. If you're a good tackle, that'll also be a draw. That'll also be the backside of power. That'll also be the front side of a shotgun inside zone where the ball's probably not going to get to you. So you can make it look similar enough to other things where they can't key in on that. But either way, you're kind of getting lined up. And so if you're lining up off that guard, and if the guard has variability, and a lot of variability based on run, closer, pass, further, you might think you're great and you have the same distance that your guard, or from your guard that you always have. But now that's not okay because your guard is 1 foot further back. Because again, there's Chris Jones, he's a wide 3, I have to go block him, and oh man, this doesn't feel good. And now you're like, all right, well, I'm usually this far, behind him. And now it doesn't work because he's a foot further back and you're that much further back from the center. So there are kind of those intricacies, and that's what, I understand a penalty, I understand the warning and a penalty. It's not great, I don't like any sort of penalties, especially as the player to hurt your team. But I'll talk about once that happens, once you get warned, what the process is, and how to fix it in the next video. Okay, so now as the player, now I will say most games I got warned that I was too deep. We talked about why offensive linemen, tackles in particular, like the space. I've already told you I'm a slower offensive tackle. I needed all the help I could get. And so I would mostly get warned every game, and then I would make that adjustment, or I would make sure I was good with the ref. And this is what gets into, I wouldn't say my issue, but like with any offensive tackle that's getting repeated penalties, I just don't buy that that's valid. Like, you're costing your team, and I think you should have some personal responsibility and accountability to make it right and to not hurt your team. And so what I would do, one, I was talking to the refs. Like, I like kind of refereeing, I like the rules, I like to talk to them, ask them questions, and I do think they care about that. I think they like to see guys show interest. I think they enjoy the interaction. I mean, I always did. So I don't think maybe consciously that they're making any calls differently, but if they have a positive sentiment towards people, we understand why home field advantage can exist and why some refs can call certain things on one sidelines versus the other. So usually they don't necessarily warn you directly. Sometimes they will, as you're going to the huddle the next play, the guy will come up, hey, you're a little bit deep, make sure your alignment's okay. Sometimes it's on the bench and they warn the coaches, and the coaches have to then warn you. That one doesn't go over quite as well, but you get warned, right? And so from that point forward, it's my responsibility to not be offsides, to not be too deep. And so what I would do, similar to a wide receiver, you see all those receivers all the time, they're like pointing over there, or they're saying this, I'm the one off the line of scrimmage. I'd basically do that as the tackle. I'd get in my stance, I'd kind of lean over the ball, I'd look at him, I'd give him a thumbs up, he'd nod, and then we're good. And I'd do that a couple times, I'd establish that I'm in a better spot, and we'd pretty much be good the rest of the game. I didn't have to do that every single time. If we threw the ball 40 times, I wasn't looking at him all the time. It just I showed him that I cared, that I was trying, that I did the right thing, I aligned correctly, and I built that in. And so if something would pop up again, he probably wouldn't flag me right away. He'd probably say, hey, you're starting to get close again. Let's bring it back. I never I towed the line, I never got egregious with it. So if from that point forward there was a play that I was obviously offsides, he would have called it. But I made sure that didn't happen because I aligned in that manner. And so this next video is going to be fun because I'm going to talk about a few things that linemen can do. I wouldn't say trick the refs, but we could say trick the refs in terms of how to align, how to actually still have the same depth you want, but make yourself appear legal. So tune in. Okay, so this video is, quote unquote, tricks of the trade on how to fake, quote unquote, lining up on sides, but still get the depth that you require. And it gets into stances and posture. And as we defined in the first video, your helmet has to break the center's belt line, which we kind of defined as he's in his stances like this area. So when you're in your stance, and I'll turn sideways, I was a guy whose stance was kind of like this. So I wasn't particularly upright, I wasn't particularly leaned over. My first 4 years in Cleveland, I played with Joe Thomas. His stance was very leaned over. He kind of had that shot put stance, but he'd get in, he'd do his little thing. And so in Joe's stance, if I'm just gonna put this as the center's hip, Joe could get in there and he could line up here and his head could be here, and now he's legal and his feet are here. But we saw last night with Ronnie Stanley, he's got a much more vertical stance. So if I took Joe's footwork and I went in Stanley's stance, I'm a foot to 2 feet off sides. And so that's a way that you can kind of get into a stance that's maybe not as comfortable for you, but you could add a little bit of hip bend and lean to get that head across the line. And again, as I talked in the last video, if you're pointing down at the ref and making sure you're okay, I would line up like this. I kind of point down, I'm good, and then slowly just start to work back. And the feet got the depth that I wanted, but the head started in the right spot, and I already established that we're good, and then you can kind of slowly wiggle from there. So that is what I would say is the first key. And if you look at guys who do get flagged and don't get flagged, typically it's the ones with the more vertical stances, because again, that's a pretty big difference foot-wise in terms of if you're here with your head, or if you have to be up here because you got a vertical stance. So yeah, I would say that's probably the biggest trick, is to lean forward to make sure your head is crossing. It has nothing to do with where the feet are. It has nothing to do with any other parts of the body. It's just, is my head crossing that center's belt line? And so for offensive tackles that want to check in with the ref, that want to make sure that they're getting the proper alignment, but they don't want to lose the depth that they want, you just got to lean forward. It's pretty simple. It sounds easy once you say it, but it can also be tricky in the heat of the moment when you're not comfortable, when you're worried about being offsides. Maybe it's an uncomfortable feel, you don't trust your pass set quite as much, but that is a way to do it. And I'll talk about, because I want to break this up so it's not too much info, in the next video, how perception can kind of influence what the refs are seeing. So tune in for that one. Okay, we got some props. I wanted to show you guys a couple different angles. We'll see how this works out, but say this is your center, this is the full body when he's in a stance. Let's just say you have to break the back here. This is like what's considered legal. So if you have an offensive guard who's lined up a little more forward and maybe where a tackle would want him to be, say he's there, and you've got your tackle who is legal, but like just barely breaking the plane, I think this tackle is more likely to be seen as deep than a tackle whose guard aligns deep in the same spot, but now he's even. Because now they're both at the same distance, and you could say they're both offsides or they're both not offsides, but this tackle, same distance, doesn't look quite as offsides as that tackle because of this guard, because of the curvature of the offensive line, the way it looks. So that is a way that if you're a tackler, you're getting a lot of penalties. You could talk to your guard, hey, can you back up a little bit? It makes it look like I'm deep when you're aligned that much more forward than I am. Now that guard's gonna wanna do his thing and do whatever's comfortable for him, but there is a give and take, your teammates, and you wanna help out each other. And then the other, in the same way, is what the center is doing with the ball. And so you see the Chiefs and you look at Creed, he's in a stance, he's lefty, and the ball's basically underneath him. And so there's not this huge neutral zone. And so I don't know if this is an example for last night, the Baltimore and Kansas City game, but just in general, the defensive line isn't going to be as far from the offensive tackle as it would be for someone like Jason Kelsey, who had the ball way in front of him. So the defensive line could only align here, where Creed's ball is here, the defensive line could align here. And so now you're making it look like, in one example, defensive line is closer than offensive line, and there's less total distance, kind of irrespective of where this tackle's aligning off the center, as opposed to a center who's pushed the defensive line a foot or two more forward based on where he's holding it in a stance and where that tackle's lined up. And now it looks like, man, this tackle and this defensive end are really far away from each other. Maybe as the ref, I need to see if this tackle is aligned correctly on the center. So that's another way I think potentially a ref's optics or his visuals could be influenced by just what it looks like. So I think it's that kind of curvature on the offensive line when the guard and the tackle aren't at the same depth. I think it's also relative to what the center's doing, how far he has the ball forward. So those are two things that as you're watching, I would kind of try to keep in mind. Could this be a factor? Could it not be a factor? There's also camera angles, which we're seeing. Obviously the ref's not seeing that. He's always in the same spot. So when we're complaining online, it could be the camera angle, you got to kind of put that picture in your head and try to square it up. So just another couple factors that I think are really interesting. All right, so to sum it up, offensive line, we like space. It allows us to take our footwork. It allows us in pass protection to get to our spots cleaner, safer, better, more comfortably. And the rule, your helmet should be breaking the belt of the center. Now, that can be influenced by a few things. As the linemen, we get to the line, we get set, the tackles get set off the guards. The depth is kind of a thing that you're more familiar with. You're not necessarily checking, is my head at the belt buckle or not? You've got a sense for that. If you're getting warned, if you're getting flagged, that's when you need to work with that official who's flagging you. You need to ask him what it looks like. You need to ask him how deep you are. You need to get to the line of scrimmage. Look at him or her. Confirm that you're okay, do that a few times, make sure you're getting legal. And then you also have to take into account, and this is from like the fan perspective or from people watching it and looking at it. Obviously, I personally don't think the refs are trying to influence games. I don't think they're trying to be inconsistent. I think they're trying to do the best they can. They have a really hard job. We are big, fast, strong people. They can't train for that. There's only so many NFL games. Those are the training experiences. You don't get to simulate NFL speed. You don't get to simulate NFL action. So in general, I think they do a really good job, and I think they do the best they can. And so their perception might be off based on, am I aligned, further back off a guard, and it makes me look even deeper? Is my center having the ball more forward, and it seems like there's maybe a little bit more space? So another thing to consider. What it all boils down to, at the end of the day, it's on the offensive lineman to line up correctly based on what that referee is calling. So again, this first game, it seems like they told the coaches beforehand, we are not giving warnings, we are absolutely calling this. And if that information did not get to the players, that's on the coaches. So if the players are saying they didn't even warn me, they just started calling flags, on the coaches for not telling the players. Now, you have 3 penalties, that's on you. At some point, you have to find your way legal. You have to make that your responsibility to your team, just as my responsibility was to protect Mahomes and Alex Smith before him and all those guys. My responsibility is to my team to line up on side so we can run a play and not go backwards. So you have to find a way to make it work. So, a lot of information. Hopefully I broke that down in a decent way for everybody. Obviously here for follow-up questions, but hope you learned something and hope you got some good information from this little session.